Hey, welcome to the video. This is Joel again. I know it's been a minute since I've recorded, just been busy with a lot of things. But just to bring you up to speed on what I'm dealing with and where I am on my journey now, spiritually. Basically, if you look at the things in the New Testament and you're honest with the origin of it and how and why it was written, things like that, I think it's smart to also look at the Old Testament as well. After all, they're in the same book. And if we're going to say we were given the New Testament as deception, then I think it would only be smart to at least consider, well, wait a minute, we were also given in the same book the Old Testament. So if these people that are trying to deceive us so well give us a fake book, so to speak, why would they waste their time giving us the full truth right next to it in the same book? And I would think about that, but when I was first looking at some of the information as far as the New Testament, I knew of some of the problems with the Old Testament, and I knew that there was things that needed to be looked at. But to be honest with you, I didn't want to deal with it at the time. It was really just too much for me to deal with. I didn't want to. I was basically scared. And it is scary. It's not. This isn't easy. What I'm about to talk about. And I know some of you see the title and you're already horrified. But we have to deal with it. The thought is, where do we go from there? And that's the fear. And then that opens up the possibility of a lot of things, like what are we supposed to believe in? Are we supposed to believe in God at all? Maybe there's no God. What's our whole purpose in being here? And things like that. So I didn't want to go down that road per se. This is just to give you an idea of why I'm now saying, yes, the Bible as a whole is mythology and astrology. It's not something literal as far as literal events that actually happen. Um, it's allegorical in nature. This is not to get you to convince you to do anything or to be like me, agree with me, follow me, none of that stuff. It's just my stance. I'm not judging anybody who's not on board with my stance as far as you being evil or stupid. I'm just telling you where I'm at, and everybody's at where they're at, and that's all. Okay? Because what I'm dealing really with in this video is just the stories and the origin of the Bible stories being based on mythology that was already prevalent in different civilizations and customs and areas during that time, and even hundreds, thousands of years before the Bible was written. And even before some of those so-called stories were supposedly have taken place, those very same ideas were already in existence, and we can't ignore that. And I could no longer ignore that. So, page 14. Before I even get into that, I just want to first talk briefly about when the Bible was written and the history of how it was put together, just real briefly, because we got to deal with that too. Because making things in the Bible to be historical, there's a lot of different problems with doing that. Even though I'm just really focusing in this video on the mythological aspects of the stories themselves, there's a lot of different ways you can go and see there's issues as far as archaeological, uh, historical, dating, things like that. But that's not what I'm really dealing with. But I'm just gonna touch on some things real quick. So basically, what it says in this book I'm using, because it's I consider it to be non-biased, where they're being honest about historical information, but at the same time they're not anti-Bible as far as they still look at they still reference the Bible as if it's something that may have happened or whatnot, but they are being honest about certain elements of history concerning how it was put together when it was written, such and such. So it says, first, as far as the oldest parts of the Bible, it says the stories were not only type of material passed on by storytellers, they were also proverbs, prayers, lyrics, poems, songs, riddles, things like that. Because in the ancient world, that was, kind of the way they dealt with their what people call religion now or mythology. They would write poems, songs, things like that. And some of the oldest parts of the Bible are those parts, the songs, proverbs, things like that. There's a reason for that. And that reveals the repetitive nature of some of the things in the Bible because those are things other people are doing too. And you can see how closely related they are. Page 15, it says, the Hebrews were not the only people to pass along stories orally. A number of ancient Babylonian narratives parallel those in the Bible. One such tale, later set down as a poem, the Enuma Elish, tells of the creation of heaven and earth. It says, on the other hand, the creation account of the Hebrews affirm that the one true God created everything and holds all creation in his grasp. The vision of God makes the Hebrews unique in the ancient world. It says storytelling then was not merely for entertainment, rather, it was a way of preserving the culture of the people, of letting them know who they were and how they differed from their neighbors. That's what the Bible was in the beginning. It was some people that put together some stories so they can have their own identity different than some of the, I guess we'll say, cultural mythologies around them. But because they're a product of what's around them, they still are based on what was around them, but they just make tweaks and differences to make it their own. And I think that's how the Bible came to be. So it goes on to say, in order to make a point, storytellers sometimes supplemented their narratives with unrelated stories from other traditions. Some of these stories have survived independently of the Bible. One of them may be the ancient Egyptian tale of two brothers. What they're saying here, the tale of two brothers, is an Egyptian story, and you can see traces of the Joseph story. He says, in this tale, a woman tries to seduce her brother-in-law, and when he rejects her advances, the woman is afraid of what will happen if her husband finds out. Husband comes home, and, she accuses the brother of rape, and brother is forced to flee for his life, and things like that. It says, some scholars say that a Hebrew storyteller may have borrowed this story and adapted it for use in the saga of Joseph. So this is the thing. If that's going on, if these type of stories existed before the Bible says they were supposed to, then they're not original. And if they're not original, how can we stand on the Bible? And this is the unadulterated, only word of God directly from his mouth through Moses, and everything else is of the devil. That's the type of stance we've taken on the Bible, and we've judged everyone else outside of that realm. But for me, I can no longer take that stance because, um, as I said before, everything has to come down to what can we verify? Is that something we can verify? That's just something that's traditional. We've been told that in tradition, but we can verify the themes of these stories existed before. And it goes on to say, if a Hebrew storyteller did deliberately incorporate the Egyptian tale into Joseph's narrative, he was not trying to falsify history as we understand it. He was probably only attempting to illustrate that Joseph was an upright or moral man, and that God would take care of him no matter how cruel he was treated by the outside world. And he rises to power just like Joseph in this story. So they're being nice, trying to say that well, the writer here is not trying to falsify history as we understand it. See, he's coming from the angle that the Bible is history. But if you look at it as just stories, then you won't have a problem with this altering history because it was never history anyway. But they have to put that in there because this writer still wants to be fair and respect that a lot of people think Bible is history. But like I said before, if it's taken from something else, then that's the true origin. The brothers are Anubis and Beta, you know, and you can see the parallels between both stories. It's really the same story as far as that whole situation with the wife and all that. Some of the things that were the oldest parts as far as songs, like Deborah's song in Judges 5, Exodus 15, Miriam's song after God parted the Red Sea, and some of them are like poems. And if you look at another source, another book called Did Moses Exist, on page 136, it says parts of Judges, which is Judges 5, I just mentioned the Song of Deborah. It recounts the conquest of peoples in Canaan by the Israelites, representing a summary of germane themes in the Pentateuch. However, the actual fundamental story itself is never mentioned in any specifics. Like the Song of the Sea, Deborah's ditty contains anachronisms such as victory over the Edomites, reflecting once more the enemies of Hezekiah and Josiah centuries later. These are other problems that you can find throughout the scripts, is certain things are mentioned in the wrong time period. Okay? You shouldn't hear about victory over the Edomites in the days of Deborah, but that's the way it's written. Letting you know that it's a later date, these are written than what we're told. But in reality, these older linguistic forms could represent archaicisms from an underlying oral tradition, originally Canaanite, since they evidently were in existence before the emergence of Hebrew as a separate Semitic dialect. These type of writings were already around. Remember I said Song of the Sea, these type of songs or the flavor of these songs already existed. And it would make sense for those to be the oldest parts of the Bible. And remember, what the suggestion here is that it started with that, but you don't see the actual Exodus or the actual stories that we get from the Bible yet. We only have this song. And my thing is, it looks to me more like the stories were written later, around those song themes. Okay. But the song themes can be traced back to other cultures. Because if you pay attention to Deborah's song, it's talking about the Exodus battle, but you don't hear Moses or Joshua included in the song. You just hear about a battle, and it sounds like it, but it doesn't have those details. Question is, could it be because those details weren't written yet? If you look at Psalm 78, I think it's verse 2, it says, basically these writings are dark sayings of old. It says, I will open my mouth in a parable and I will utter dark sayings of old. That type of wording, when you say dark sayings of old, in the ancient world, that would allude to a myth. When you say dark sayings of old, they would think you're talking about mythology. And that's a clue. And when we go through some of this stuff, you're going to see the people that wrote this, they leave clues in the scriptures, letting you know what it's really talking about. And I believe that's a big clue there. Basically, we're really dealing with older mythology, sayings of old. Okay, older mythology, just like. Well, anyway, we won't get into the giants and all that. So anyway, page 35 in back to the Bible book. It says almost half the Psalms are attributed to King David. And it says, David, however, may not have written many of the 73 Psalms attributed to him. The Hebrew designation that bears his name is Le David, or Le is a preposition that can mean by, for, or about. Like I was saying, Psalm of David, that of can be about David, like I was saying in my last video. Yet, if David did not write these Psalms, at least his life inspired them. So again, they're being nice here. Well, if he didn't write it, at least the character David, inspired them at least. But we've been taught that he wrote them. So it says many scholars, and that's another thing. You know, the reason why we stand on the Bible as God's word is because we say God spoke through David. God spoke directly to Moses. Now, if we take all that away, then should we still stand on the Bible on that level? And we're going to see we can't really prove any of that. It's just tradition. It says many scholars say these superscript references to David were probably added by editors long after the Psalms were composed. No one knows when the songs were written. So they don't really know. You know, just like the New Testament, you know, the Catholic Church admitted we don't know who wrote the Gospels. And those names you have, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they admit that those are additions. The original were anonymous. So if you see Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that means somebody just made it up. So question is the Old Testament any better? Basically, as far as what they think, as far as how the Bible was put together, some of the oldest parts, um, they think the stories, a lot of the stories came about, stories and tradition was about 9 BC. Then the Moses and the prophets part was about 8 BC. And then 621 BC and forward is the rest of the works, which were written much later. And just an example of little things you can see in the scriptures that show that it wasn't written when you thought is, for example, if you look at the whole thing about by the rivers of Babylon, uh, that Psalm 137 and 1. There we sat down and there we wept when we remembered Zion. That's not something David would have wrote because that's the Babylonian captivity was way after, but it's a psalm. See what I'm saying? So again, a lot of these things were written way later than what tradition tells us they were written. Same thing with the writings of so-called writings of Moses. Okay. Also, it says there's striking similarities between some of the Hebrew Psalms and songs found in the literary works of ancient cultures: Egyptians, Canaanites, Babylonians, and Assyrians. The parallels are sometimes so obvious that scholars suspect people in ancient times occasionally borrowed songs from other cultures and adapted them to fit their beliefs. This is what the scholars say. Now, we can be like, should we even believe these scholars or whatever? The thing is, that's why I wanted to focus on the stories of mythology in the Bible itself, because the writings to me are the greatest evidence as to the validity of it, what's actually in it, and what's it talking about. If it's something that was talked about before, that lets you know that this thing was written um, as a copy or a continuation of things that already existed, cultures, religions, or whatever you want to call it, mythologies that already existed, rather than it being exclusive. Like we were taught in a pagan world, God picked one people to be his, and they're the ones that had the truth. I'll get more into that later. Another thing is supposedly the Hebrews could not read or write. This is what this book is telling us as far as how the Bible could have been written. It says on page 19, the Hebrews must have seen both cuneiform and hieroglyphic writing as they were displayed in public places. However, it is likely that very few Hebrews were able to read or write. Their time of literacy was to come with the invention of the alphabet. And it also says, technically, the collection of symbols or letters used in writing Hebrew is not an alphabet, but an abjad. An abjad is the equivalent of an alphabet that has no symbols to represent vowel sounds. Now that's interesting. Basically, this is not Hebrew's not the same as other languages, um, and it's not really an alphabet. And that's another revealing thing about the Bible is the language, which I'm not dealing with the language, but if you deal with the language itself, that reveals certain things that are really talked about. But what's interesting is it says these texts date from about 1050 to 850 BC. Um, well, this is saying although the earliest surviving alphabet was created before the Phoenicians arrived in Canaan, about 1200 BC, the Phoenicians produced the most extensive body of surviving texts using an alphabet. Okay, and those texts date from 1050 to 850 BC. Consequently, the writing system developed in ancient Canaan. It's generally referred to as the Phoenician alphabet. The Hebrew alphabet is its direct descendant. So that brings into question the purpose of a Hebrew language anyway, because put it like this. Like I said, if this Bible is based on older traditions, okay, and like I said, these type of writings were made to give people a identity, a specific identity, as opposed to other people, something that's their own, right? That would make sense with the Hebrew language as well. On page 22, it says, from the 5th century BC on, the Israelites began to speak Aramaic, the language of their Persian conquerors, and as time went by, Hebrew was used solely for worship and holy scripture. In Hebrew, it says, although many non biblical texts were written in Hebrew in ancient times, none of these writings survive today. So, most of what we have surviving as far as what's written in Hebrew is what we know as the Bible. It says, aside from some inscriptions and monuments and walls and writing on ancient coins, the old ancient Hebrew writing that survives is found in the Old Testament. What does that mean? Other traditions and cultures and people had all kinds of writings, um, Assyrians, you got all kinds of Ugaric writing, Greeks, you got all kinds of things people wrote down in their language according to those particular people. But only when it comes to Hebrew, what this writer is saying, again, being nice probably, is, things were written but nothing survived. So why don't we have other Hebrew writings, like people writing letters to each other? Why don't we have non-religious writing? So we have two things. We have the Hebrew language that's not really an alphabet, and you can pretty much put in vowels as you see fit because it's, a, it's not a real alphabet with vowels like other languages, and it's only used for religion. What does that mean? That means there's probably an agenda here, political or otherwise. Um, the Hebrew language is close to Ugaric. It's even close to Greek. It's close to other languages. But it's when I say close, it's close with a few tweaks here. It's some things are minute differences. It's so close to some of these languages. So you have to think, you know, did a people who are already familiar with these other languages or even came from some of these backgrounds, did they just take a language they were already familiar with and change it a little bit, or did they have their own language? It's different. So could they have used the language, made some changes for the purpose of this religion they wanted to create through the Bible for that purpose? Because I believe now, had they used one of those other languages, that would tell on the stories. If they use Ugaric, if they use Assyrian, if they use another language, then that would be like, um, then these people really come from there, rather than it being something Israelite, different from any other people. So you had to have a new language, so to speak. This is what I think happened now. Because if if you have a language that's solely identified with one people, why is it so much like the other ones in this way? And you can't find any writings. They say they couldn't. Their reasoning is they couldn't read or write or whatever, but still, other people they were around could. So that doesn't make sense. So if people were using if they wanted to come up with a new language already similar to like Ugaric, why didn't they call it Ugarish? Okay, or a Syrish language if there's just um, some slight changes, but it's really the same language with some slight changes. Why didn't they do that? Why are we being told so much Hebrew? It's something totally different. Why are they pushing that? Because they're trying to push the Bible. They tried to push something that was different than what was already around. But the question is, how original is it really? So anyway, this is also why we have the Septuagint. Now, what do they say about that? We're told the Septuagint is some of the oldest Old Testament writings, but it's written in Greek. It's not written in Hebrew, but they'll say that's the oldest that we have, and those are copies. And that was written, they say 285, between 285 and 247 BC, or 225, 247 BC, something like that. But we only have copies, and that was written during the Ptolemy time in Alexandria, Egypt, during the Greek rule. So um, we're told that this is a Greek translation of an older Hebrew Bible. But the thing is, we can't verify that there was an older Hebrew Bible. We're just told that. So the question is this the true beginning of the Bible as far as what we can verify? If it is, then that answers the question as to why there's so many inconsistencies and problems in the Old Testament, some of which I already quickly mentioned. Why some things are mentioned before the time they're supposed to be, you know. A lot of the things we call prophecies. Well, if it was written in the Greek period or closer to the Greek period, then it's writing in retrospect, and it's just writing as if it's future prophecy to us, but it was actually written way after a lot of what's called future prophecy, um, as far as it being certain things in the Bible being before the Greek period. What if it was actually written during the Greek period? But like I said, even more important than that is some of the Greek mythology and a lot of the mythology that existed then. That's straight up in the Bible, and that's the greatest example of why this isn't a original book based on literal events. It's based on mythology that already existed. So And another thing is if you look at some of the words that are used, remember I mentioned the different languages and how similar Hebrew is? Some words in so called Hebrew actually are identical to terms written in Ugaric and other dialects, okay? Like you have El Shaddai and terms for God like El, which were used before the Bible times. But those are supposed to be specific to the Hebrew culture. Why are other cultures that we call pagan using it? The translation of El, and you can just do a search as far as Wikipedia or whatever on some of these terms. El as God or Lord is in the Ugaric Canaanite ancient language. So they're related to solar deities in the Canaanite world. And it says the Hebrew here for God Almighty is El Shaddai, the latter word used 48 times in the Old Testament. El Shaddai is evidently a Ugaric Canaanite god, one of the 70 Elohim or sons of El, like the limbs of the main god within the religious philosophy of Egypt in India, for example, blah, blah, blah. But it's Canaanite, and it talks about it's one of the 70 Elohim, which that's a number that's used throughout the Bible. That 70, that's sort of a special, we'll just say magical number. You'll see that number a lot, like the Septuagint, that comes from 70. They said that was supposed to be written by 70 or 72 scholars in Alexandria. That number is going to keep popping up because it means something. Remember, I told you this is sort of like a code or a puzzle. Um, what we see as literal in the Bible, there's a underlining meaning giving us meanings of other things that were already in existence in the ancient world. If you have a certain mindset and if you're familiar with certain terms and certain belief systems, then you'll know it's really talking about something totally different outside of what it seems like it's talking about literally. And little hints like the number 70, that is a red light to people that already have that kind of understanding, that type of stuff. Page 42 in Did Moses Exist? It says, since the Pentateuch is clearly not a historical text written by Moses, the biblical story at Deuteronomy 31:24, purporting the patriarch's composition of the Mosaic or Jewish law, is thus unsustainable factually. When Moses had finished writing the words of this law in a book to the very end, that's what it says. That quote in the scripture, it says, there simply exists no evidence for the law's genesis as depicted in the Bible. The reality is that the evidence, including the Bible itself, indicates the law was composed long after Moses' purported time. Okay, and so also on page 59 of the Bible history concerning Isaiah, it says the book of Isaiah contains predictions of Cyrus's saving action, but it says these predictions and the rest of chapters 40 to 55 of Isaiah were probably written by an anonymous prophet using the name of the earlier prophet Isaiah shortly before Cyrus's victory. So you got stuff like that, and then you have Psalms chapter 104 that is basically a copy of something that the Egyptians already had. So the Egyptians had basically a psalm almost exactly like it. This is from Did Moses Exist, page 51. It says Psalms 104. It says the contention is made by Messianic Nazari Jewish minister Andrew Gabriel Roth. According to this guy, Psalms 104 was written 400 years before David was even born and found on the tomb wall of Akhenaten, the first known Egyptian king to worship a single deity. Page 64, it says, within this syncretism appear solar concepts, as in the biblical Psalm 104, and this is talking about the great hymn to Aten that we were just talking about. That's what it's called. It says Psalms 104, based on the same genre as Akhenaten's famous great hymn to Aten, while Akhenaten flourished in the 14th century BC. The earliest psalm by conservative dating was written during the First Temple period, which traditionally began around 950 BCE, with the latest psalm perhaps composed during the 6th century BCE. Critical scholars date the composition or compilation of biblical texts to later centuries, although these scriptures may represent more ancient writings and oral traditions to some extent, as is surely the case with Psalms 104. So here's the way it sounds when you compare the two. For example, it'll say in the hymn to Aten, the hymn says, "How many are your deeds? You make the earth as you wish, you alone, all peoples, herds, and flocks." Psalms 104, Yahweh, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. The hymn says, every lion comes from its den. Psalms, the young lions roar for their prey. When the sun rises, they withdraw and lie down in their dens. It says, when you have dawned, they live. When you set, they die. All solar attributes, right? The Psalm says, when you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die. The entire land sets out to work. Psalm says, people go out to their work and to their labor until the evening. You can see, obviously, one's based on the other. Now, if Psalms is directly from God, exclusive to Israel, aside from all the other evil pagans, then it should not be that close to something the Egyptians wrote way before, or any other culture. It should be exclusive to the God of Israel. And that's just one example. And then you have what's called the Treaty of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria. This was written, they say, about 627 BC. Now, what this is a treaty that the king of Assyria wanted people to follow, and if not, then there's curses that are detailed as a part of this that were proclaimed. Now, when you read these curses, I want you to think of the book of Deuteronomy 28, and you tell me how this sounds. This is how the curses read. For example, this is the standard curse section number 37. It says, may Assur, king of the gods, who decrees the fates, decree an evil and unpleasant fate for you. May he not grant you long-lasting old age and the attainment of extreme old age. 38a says, may Anu, king of the gods, let disease, exhaustion, malaria, sleeplessness, worries, and ill health reign upon all your houses. So it has the worries and the ill health, sleeplessness. And then 40 has, may Samas, the light of heaven and earth, not judge you justly. May he remove your eyesight, walk about in darkness. So that's that blindness. And then 41 says, may Ninurta, the foremost among the gods, fell you with his fierce arrow. May he fill the plain with your blood and feed your flesh to the eagle and the vulture. May Venus, the brightest of the stars, before your eyes make your wives lie in the lap of your enemy. May your sons not take your possession of your house, but a strange enemy divide your goods. So the stranger's going to take your goods, and you want to have possession of your own house, and your wife, another man will lie with her, just like what we read in Deuteronomy 28. And then 45, I'm not going to read all of them, but 45 says, may Zarpanito, who grants name and seed, destroy your name and your seed from the land. You'll be destroyed off the land. May the locust, who diminishes the land, devour your harvest. In your hunger, eat the flesh of your sons. In want and famine, may one man eat the flesh of another. This sounds just like Deuteronomy 28, man. 49. May Nergal, hero of the gods, extinguish your life with his merciless sword and send slaughter and pestilence among you. 56. May all the great gods of heaven and earth who inhabit the universe and are mentioned by name in this tablet strike you, look at you in anger, and curse you grimly with a painful curse. May food and water abandon you. May want and famine, hunger and plague never be removed from you. May your days be dark and your years dim. May darkness which is not to be brightened be declared as your fate. May your life end in exhaustion and sleeplessness. May Gira, who gives food to small and great, burn up your name and your seed. May all the gods that are mentioned by name in this treaty tablet make the ground as narrow as brick for you. May they make your ground like iron so that nothing can sprout from it. Remember that from Deuteronomy? The heaven above will be like iron, and the ground below. 97 says, just as the noise of the doves is persistent, so may you, your women, your sons and your daughters have no rest or sleep, and may your bones never come together. Which kind of reminds me of the Valley of Dry Bones scenario. So how do we get around this? How do we explain why this is almost just like Deuteronomy 28, and it's something coming from what we call the pagan nation of Assyria? If this is supposed to be straight from God, do you see the influence? And I actually saw this recently on Dagger Squad. I got this from Garfield Reed actually. Now here's a quick commentary on the vassal treaties. It's called "Building on Stone: Deuteronomy and Esarhaddon's Loyalty Oaths, Part 1. Some preliminary observations." This is by Marcus Zender. It says one finds the view that the Deuteronomic phenomenon, in quotes, is the theological response to the identity crisis of Judah as Yahweh's people in the 7th century at the time of the Assyrian domination over Judah. In order to cope with this crisis, the Deuteronomic theologians used the literary device of a treaty because of its high prestige in the dominating Neo-Assyrian culture. A copy of the vassal treaties of Assyrian was, according to this view, available in the royal archives in Jerusalem, and parts of it were used as models in the writing of Deuteronomy, sometime between 672 and 612 BC. This provides us with an external point of reference for the dating of Deuteronomy, and by extension for the Pentateuch as a whole. It goes on to say, if these assumptions are right, we would in fact possess a kind of historical anchor that permits us to date the origins of the book of Deuteronomy, and thereby perhaps even to find a safe basis for the reconstruction of the origins of the literary history of the Pentateuch as a whole. Remember, we were reading about when these things were actually written, right? So this is hard to deal with because Deuteronomy 28 is, for a lot of us, the main chapter and the main reason why we became Hebrew Israelites in the first place. This is what connects us to the Bible, those curses. So it's pretty devastating to think that that information came from another source and was not something that originated by Moses and by the mouth of God only. How do we explain why the Assyrians have the same type of curse descriptions if the Bible is just exclusive to Israel and doesn't have any other origin or source or influence? How do we explain that? So I'm going to get more into this. There's other things, a lot of the other stories. I'll just stop here for right now, but I'm going to get into the Abraham, Garden of Eden, Jacob, Esau, and also Moses. We'll stop right here for now. I appreciate you watching if you got this far, and there'll be more to come.